That's a funny story. My major is philosophy, and a former philosophy instructor of mine decided not to pursue his PhD in philosophy. We had become friends, and he kept bugging me to go work for him. And I was looking for a job in philosophy, and I was SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, had long hair, granny glasses, army jacket. He finally convinced me to talk to Ralph Peters, who was his boss. I don't know if you know who Ralph Peters was. And we had lunch, and I got offered the job, and I said, Ralph, I want you to understand that I'm not going to cut my hair or change how I dress. And Ralph said to me, if you make me money, I don't care what you look like. And that was my introduction to capitalism. So I worked for him for 3 years doing fundamental research before I got a chance to get on the floor. I bought my membership in 1973 with a bank loan and a loan from Les Rosenthal. I was doing brokerage and trading a little bit. I think about 6 or 7 months after I got my membership, I brought a check to Les for his half of the money that the bank didn't lend me. And Les said, have you paid the bank off? And I said, no. And he ripped up the check and he said, pay them off first and then pay me. And about a year later, I paid him off. Yes, I helped a bunch of people. This was a business where friends and family get involved in the business. But I remember the first guy that I ever hired was, unlike me, who was SDS, he was a Navy veteran. And I hired him, and he wanted to get on the floor. And I got him on the floor, and he became a member both of the Board of Trade and the CME. Other people I've sponsored, I've lent money to buy their seats. This was a business where you try to help everybody else. It was exciting. Everything was new every day. You started all over. I mean, even if you had a position, you started all over. So there was no real routine except for coming down and doing it. It wasn't working in an office. It wasn't doing the same thing over and over again. And certainly, after a few years, I was working for myself, so I didn't have to answer to anybody. I could do what I wanted to do. The opportunity was the market moving and being able to participate in the market, whether you were almost broke, had a little bit of money, or had a lot of money. You could be first on the market, you could not be first on the market and get a piece of a trade. You had the opportunity to make your own life. You had the opportunity to make your own decisions. They tell me, I never did the statistics, but they tell me that 70 or 80% of the people never made it. A lot of people showed up and found out that they weren't fit for it. They didn't have the emotional, psychological talents for it, and they disappeared. But the ones who stuck found a way to make a living. They found a way to trade and make a living. I remember in the early days in the silver pit, there was a trader, Bob Rowland, who was like the maestro of the silver pit. And his brother was trading in New York, and he would get messages from his brother about what was happening in New York, and he would move the market his way and move the market the other way. So I decided I'd try to be like him, and every time I tried to be like him, I'd lose money. So I finally decided that he was he and I was I, and I had to develop my own style. Bob unfortunately went broke and left the business, and I stuck. So basically speaking, I mean, I was a medium-sized position trader, but basically a day trader. I would take scalping opportunities, but I would day trade. I would see what the market trends were, and I would follow the trends. Probably became more cautious as I got older. I think once you make money, you don't want to lose as much money. When you're young and don't have a lot of money, you do a lot of stupid things. So I think that as time went on, I became more cautious. Some people would say I got a little smarter about what to do, but I don't know if it was smarter. I think it was just more cautious. You always got butterflies. Whether you had a position on or you didn't have a position on, just the tension started rising and you didn't know which way it was going to go. And the one time that I really remember, well, I guess I remember 2 times. One time I remember on the opening, one of the brokers came up to me literally with tears in his eyes and said, I don't know where I'm at. Here, you do the opening. And and I said to him, do you have any idea whether you need to be a buyer or a seller, how many, whatever? And he said, I think I need to be a buyer. And I said, okay. He handed me the deck, and I wound up buying 50 or 100 silver on the opening and counted it up, and I wound up underbuying by 30 or 40. But that was just nuts. I mean, here was a grown man older than me literally weeping on the opening. So, I mean, he couldn't take the tension. So that was strange. And then I remember when the stock market crashed. One of my brokers in the pit had an error, and we were looking at $150,000, $200,000 loss. So I walked into the pit, and nobody knew where the opening was, and it called lower. And when the bell rang, I started bidding, and everybody started bidding, and then I sold them, and the market crashed. So they turned a $150,000 loser into a $60,000 loser. But the openings were very strange. Everybody was looking at everybody else. Everybody was looking at the paper. Sometimes the brokers would give you an idea about what was going on, but most of the time they were laying in the weeds. The openings were fun. You got butterflies, but it was exciting. We were always stuck on the close, and that's why we traded on the curb. And we would either even up on the curb, which some people went to jail for, and they now call it the modified or whatever. But yeah, we accommodated the brokers. If the brokers had stuff that came in a microsecond before the bell rang, they needed to fill their orders, and we would accommodate. And if it was more than we wanted to handle, we would look around and see who wanted to do the opposite side and trade on the curb. One of the guys that did not clear through me but stood behind me, who was an honest trader on the floor, got indicted and literally went to jail for trading on the curb. And he kept his seat, and several years later, he came to me and said, the Board of Trade will allow me to trade for my own account, but the CFTC has lawyers and they want to stop me from going back on the floor. Will you testify for me? And it must have been 5 years afterwards, because I think the statute of limitations had run out. So I get sworn in before an administrative law judge, and his attorneys ask me who I am and what my credentials are and what I know, and yada-da, yada-da, and I answer all the questions. Would you clear this guy? I said, I'd clear him tomorrow. I think he's an honest guy. He got caught for trading on the curb. The lawyers from the CFTC come up to me and they say, you know that was illegal. And I said, well, I know that's why he went to jail. And then they say to me, did you do it? Thinking that I would either deny that I did it, which would mean, well, you wouldn't do it. This guy did it. He broke the law. He went to jail. And they dared me to admit that I did. And I said, I did. You guys looked at us doing it for years. We now have the modified. I did it. And I looked at the judge, and the judge was shaking his head and laughing. And the guy was alive back on the floor. We got Black-Scholes computer program, and we developed a program where you put in the data, and it was not as sophisticated as it is now, but it certainly gave us risk parameters and helped us identify where the risk was coming from traders. Their decisions were their decisions, and if they wanted to make larger trades or larger bets, as long as they had the money, that was fine with us. Basically speaking, we would analyze the risk, and we would look at the trader and look at the record that we had with the trader, and we would let a trader do what they wanted to do commensurate with their style and their money. I think the camaraderie. I mean, there was a lot of people down on the floor, but you spent more time with people on the floor than you spent with anybody, including your wife. So there were people that I became very good friends with. There was a bunch of people I didn't like, but I liked the camaraderie. I enjoyed it. It was nice seeing people every day, spending time talking during the middle of the day, finding about their lives, and the action of the market. It's exciting, the ups and downs. Big losing days. Those are the scariest days. You don't know what you're going to tell your wife. You don't know if you're going to make it back. So those are bad days. Also, when we were clearing people, we had a couple of days when brokers had big losses, and I had to cover their losses, and that's no fun either. When Hunt was being squeezed out, I was long some silver on a break, and I was down, I don't know how much, $150,000, $200,000, and did a 180 and wound up making $150,000 on the day. So I guess that's my best day, the most memorable day, from being almost wiped out to having a phenomenal day. One day when the Hunt thing was going on, I walked on the floor and I had a profitable error with Drecky. Called up their trade checker. In fact, I even called up New York and I said, I got an out trade. It's a winning out trade. They said, we don't know it. We absolutely don't know it. We've checked everything. We don't know it. The rules of the game were after the opening, it's yours. So I took the out trade. And 2 days later, I get a phone call at home from Drecky's number 2. And Drecky, I guess, was on the phone. And he accused me of stealing the trade. And I told him what the rules were and tough potatoes and whatever. And he said, I'm going to take you to the FBI. I'm going to take you to the CFTC. And that broker said that the broker disgorged half of his profit because I'd split the error with the broker. And I went to Les Rosenthal and I asked him what to do. And he says, well, you're right, but you want to fight it. See if you can split it with Drecky. So I wound up splitting my half with him. And I think I made $80,000 or $90,000 on the error, but he was a jerk. You developed a relationship. They would know whether you were honest with your bids and offers, and you knew whether they were honest with what they were doing. If they were stuck on something or whatever, sometimes you'd take more than you wanted to take, and then presumably they would appreciate it. Almost everybody did. Most of the brokers were absolutely fair brokers. They would know what size you usually took. Sometimes you'd take more if they had a big order or whatever, but we also were allowed to have Ginzies in those days. So if you took a number and they had more to sell and nobody else wanted to take the rest, you'd get a better price for the rest. And they know you'd do a Ginzie if that's what your habit was, if that's what your style was. I remember one time I saw a small trader who was a broker, dual trading broker, sell some stuff, and then 15 seconds later, and he sold it to me, 15 seconds later offered 500. And after the flurry ended, I walked up to him and I said, did you sell that stuff to me for your own account? And he looked at me and I said, let me see your card. And he said, yeah. I said, you ever do that to me again, I'm going to kill you. And he apologized, and it never happened again. So everybody was a little greedy sometimes, but you'd know who you're dealing with. Everybody competed, but you don't work other locals. I mean, there was people down there who, if they saw you were in trouble, tried to make your trouble worse. And you learned who those people were. But that was never my style. On the contrary, I would like to try to help people that were in trouble as long as they weren't the jerks down there. And there was only a few jerks. Every person, just like playing poker, they would have a tell. And you would know when they were starting to get in trouble. You'd know when their position was larger than it should be and whatever. And you take that into account. It's not like you tried to force them to puke stuff out or whatever, but I would know that they weren't going to be there for the next trade. I would sit on the steps and read. I always brought a book with me. So I read a lot of books on the floor. And then anytime you'd hear any noise or whatever, you'd look up and you'd look to see what runner was coming near the pit, because you'd know what runners go to what brokers. And you'd stand up and you'd bid and offer. But basically speaking, I would sit on the floor and read. Well, trading on the curb was illegal, but we traded on the curb. So I saw that. People were evening up all the time, so we would see that all the time. But there were also brokers who, on the opening, on the close, would keep some of the stuff aside and feed their buddies or their relatives. There were back month brokers who would do it as a matter of course. They would tell the guy, oh, I got a lot to buy or a lot to sell. And the guy would trade into the front month, and then all of a sudden the order would come out of the back month. But again, we would learn who they were. I chaired floor governors for 6 years. So we suspended and fined a bunch of those people when we found them. The audit trails got more and more sophisticated, obviously. But there were people down there who were not honorable, but it was a small percentage of people. Nobody knew what was going on until they arrested people that night. But this guy came and wanted to be a local through us. And we checked him out, and the FBI had, I guess, created a great resume for him. He had recommendations, he had the education, he had experience, he had some money, And he started being a local in the soybean pit, and I was trading in the soybean pit at the time. And he would come to my office and ask me what he should do, how he should trade, how to make money down there. And I would tell him what little wisdom I had. And he made money. He was a pretty good trader. But I remember one day, and he traded way across the pit from me, and I almost never traded with him. One day I had an out trade with him. And I went across the pit, and I couldn't believe I had an out trade with him, because I didn't generally have out trades. And I owed him some money, and I said, how should I handle it? And he says, well, you tell me, how should you handle it? I said, the right way is to give you a check. I'm going to give you a check. And I wound up giving him a check as opposed to a trade or something else. And a few weeks later, it all came out that he was the mole, that he was recording everything. And I wound up running into him 2 or 3 years later on the street. And he said, oh, gee, Jake, you were one of the honest ones. And that kind of pissed me off because almost all of us were the honest ones down there. Obviously, it changed everything when it occurred. People were scared. They didn't trust each other. They didn't help each other the way we used to help each other. It changed the pit. Great deeds were generally helping other people when it was limit up or limit down, if they were stuck. I mean, if it was limit up and I was long and some guy comes in and says, I need 4 or whatever, we would get together and give him the 4 or the 20 or whatever. If there was a big out trade and a guy took a big loss, we would make sure that the guy got a good trade back and stuff. So the good deeds were, and about 80 or 90% of the people would participate in taking care of each other on some level. Not making sure that they made a living, but making sure that if something bad happened, we would mitigate what was going on as being bad. You learn a lot about people, and you learn about fear, you learn about greed, you learn about honesty, you learn that people are complex, you learn that certain people will behave certain ways during certain types of circumstances. Les Rosenthal was my huge mentor. He's the guy that helped me get my seat. I became a prop trader for him doing an arbitrage, and I was successful at it. And one day he calls me in 2 or 3 years later and he says, you're fired. And I said, what do you mean I'm fired? He says, you're making money. I don't need your half of the money anymore. Go on your own. Don't worry about it. We'll clear you. And Les was a friend of mine and a partner of mine on and off for 40, 45 years. I was on tons of committees, on pit committees, on the original Aurora committee. The Board of Trade was a membership organization, and one of the things that the organization required of you was participation. And at that point in time, they listened to the members. Generally speaking, when people did something that broke the rules, what we would try to do is figure out whether they were systematic crooks or whether they just did something stupid because of the circumstances. And we would try to adjust the adjudication under those circumstances. If guys were always working with somebody who they were pocketing, we tried to hit them as hard as we could. If people just handled an out trade wrong or did something stupid or whatever, we would take that into account. Whereas if we had sexual harassment or anti-Semitism on the floor, and I would get involved in those things. And there was very few women on the floor, and a lot of times, as you must know, runners were often very good-looking young ladies, and there was a lot of crass and crude brokers who thought they were God's gift to humanity, and they would either touch people or say things to people, and I would come down very hard on them, and I would warn them. If the first quiet warning didn't work, I'd walk into the pit and shame them in front of all the other people around them and stuff. And I remember the corn pit was famous for being anti-Semitic, and I'm very Jewish. And when I was chairman of floor governors, the chair of that committee decided not to become chairman of that pit committee again, and he recommended somebody who was a well-known anti-Semite. And I said, that guy's not going to become chairman of the pit committee. And he says, well, I already told him he could. And he happened to be walking by, and I said, come over here. And I'm not going to use his name. And he came over, and I said, you're not going to be chair of the pit committee in the corn pit. And he says, why? I said, because you're an anti-Semite, and you say it. And he looked at me and I said, "You're not? You're an asshole. It's not going to happen." And that was that. We had a trader that cleared through us who was an options trader, but he had a yellow badge, and he would come into the bean pit to hedge his options. But he was Greek, and he spoke with an accent. And he came into the pit, and one of the other brokers started making fun of his accent. And that really pissed me off, and I went up to him in front of everybody in the pit and chewed him out and said, "He's got a yellow badge just like you've got a yellow badge. You do that again, I'm going to write you up." There was limits, there was lines. You know, the world is flexible, all shades of gray, but there were some things that I just wouldn't accept down there. I had a midlife crisis in my late 30s, and I knew I didn't want to stand on the floor when I was 55 or 60 years old. So I went to Paris for 6 months and lived in Paris for 6 months, came back and formed USA Trading. And we wound up clearing other members, other floor traders. And at one point we cleared 350 traders. But I kept going down to the floor because I liked it. It was a place to relax. Believe it or not, it was easier than running a business.